Not bad for a late afternoon session on day 3. And for those of you who know, the big boss is on stage and he's likely to make interesting comments that are worth hanging on to. So Sopnendu, no pressure on you. Just to kick off, over the course of this week, much dialogue, and even preceding this week through the precursor conversations, a lot of dialogue on the topic of digital inclusion. But what I took away across panels is it's very interesting to note that depending on the organization represented, the point of view on what is inclusion or what is needed for digital inclusion varies across a wide spectrum. And mind you, all of those points of view are absolutely valid, but I argue that it is a collective of those points of view that forms the problem. For the purpose of today's conversation, very quick recap on what I think is the definition of digital inclusion. It broadly revolves around the idea that equal, equitable, and universal access to digital literacy, digital tools, and the ability to participate in the digital economy are essential for economic and social development. All of us in this room, we live in a digitized world. For us, access to online commerce, free access to knowledge, the ability to store and transfer our data, credentials across domains are just the way of life in the 21st century. And therefore, mobility, broadband access, cloud services, digital identity, ability to pay instantly, these are all critical components of 21st century infrastructure. However, a quick reminder, a third of the world is still offline. There are 1.7 billion people who don't have a bank account, 2 billion who don't have healthcare, 300 million children who don't have access to basic education. There are going to be 1 billion seniors in the world over 60 in the next 7 years. There are 750 million youth who need to be included. 60% of the youth population is in Asia. Arguably, there is a problem. But why is it a burning problem? Because progress towards the happy state across countries is neither linear nor is it equal. And therefore, contrary to the AI session that a leading director, moderator yesterday, and he said, there is no digital divide, I actually argue that there's an increasingly problematic digital divide, and which is why there are two aspects to consider. One is the social and inclusion dimension of it, to promote universal growth and reduce inequity, but there is also a compelling economic argument that if you solve for 10% of that divide, you generate an incremental 1 to 1.5% of GDP for a nation. So there is no argument on the problem. The real issue is what can be done about it and what is needed for it. Financing, funding, investments, whatever you want to call it, is the problem. The World Bank chief today said there are two problems, affordability and accessibility. I'd like to add a third, which is usability across domains. And in order to build all of that, OECD and World Bank say there's a $2 to $3 trillion gap there. And that's a problem that it's begging to be solved, and which brings me to this distinguished panel. Let me lob the first question to Kim. Kim, what is IFC's thought on digital inclusion, more specifically digital financial inclusion, and what have you done about it? We're racing against time, so I'm just going to request my panelists to keep it pithy.
No, thank you. Thank you, Rama, and thank you for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. So as the largest development finance institution focused on investing and advising the private sector in emerging markets, digital inclusion is at the heart of our mission to reduce poverty and increase livelihoods. Because providing information to connect people, providing the masses with access to finance and access to basic consumer services such as healthcare and education will in the process create jobs, help small companies grow, increase literacy rates, and increase health outcomes, and thereby reducing poverty and and increasing livelihoods. So hence, digital inclusion is a big part of our mission. And what we have done towards closing the gaps, and as you mentioned, Rata, there are huge gaps to achieving those goals of social inclusion and digital inclusion. We have a three-pronged strategy. The first is to invest directly in businesses that provide such services to the consumers. So it's access to finance, it's access to education and healthcare through the digital channels. And examples of those are investments in Voyager, which is a company in the Philippines that provides a spectrum of financial services to the masses. We're also a shareholder in a company called Go2 in Indonesia. Many of you would know this company. It's one of the largest e-commerce platforms combined with financial services and combined with a ride-hailing app all in one that makes it a very nice ecosystem in a country where 97 million users are still not really connected to the internet. And in China, we're working with the Ant Group, and in Indonesia with Amrata to provide greater access to women-owned businesses. So that's the first prong. The second prong of the strategy is to invest in digital infrastructure, and that is everything from working, either advising or investing with mobile network operators to telecom tower companies, broadband service companies, down to data warehouses to create that infrastructure to enable the digital connectivity. And finally, the third prong of that strategy is again either advising or investing through funds who can then create a wider distribution of investments into these digital platforms. So it's education, edtech, medtech, climate tech, and of course, digital payment platforms.
Thank you, Kim. So 3 prongs, quick recap: direct investments, working on infrastructure, and then looking at innovative financing. Great. Nick has come all the way from Rwanda, and since we're running late, we're going to lose him for the final segment of this panel. So let me lob the next one.
I managed to hold on to, because I'll go together with late.
Okay, so then that's fine. Nick, anyways, a lot of what was said by Kim perhaps applies to Africa as a continent, Rwanda even more specifically. What's your experience? Does all of this resonate as requirements for you, or is there anything specific that you'd like to mention?
It resonates very much. When we talk about the digital divide from Rwanda and Africa perspective, it's 2 ways. One, there is the coverage gap, which is currently, in terms of numbers, 210 million people. When it comes to usage gap, in terms of numbers, it's around 570 million people. Now that's very concerning. In terms of World Bank estimates that to cover the digital divide by 2030, it requires $100 billion. 86 of that is infrastructure. So I hear what you're saying, but there's still much more to be done, because these are staggering numbers that require a sense of urgency that we feel needs to be galvanized across all stakeholders, from government putting in place the right policy that facilitates capital, to forming private-public partnerships, as well as creating the awareness, further awareness. And that's why, for me, it's important to participate on this session, on this panel, because it's a pertinent problem for Rwanda and for Africa, for those 3 reasons.
Brilliant. Some might argue, Sobs, that Singapore has already done a lot of it for digital infrastructure creation, and it's a developed economy, arguably the highest adoption rates globally, and yet we sit here and talk about digital inclusion, we talk about financing for digital inclusion and digital infrastructure, all of which are shared passions, right? I'll start with not the question on digital infrastructure, but what is the view from a regulatory point of view on digital inclusion, considering the amounts required? Does it become a new asset class? alongside ESG perhaps, alongside climate change investments?
Thank you, Rama, for asking this because, if putting infrastructure for financial inclusion that easy, would have done by now. It's just a lot of money, hundreds and hundreds of $1 million required. And we can inspire people with Aadhaar, which is $1 billion cost. It looks cheaper because the denominator is billion. So it looks like $1 per customer, per user. In reality, for smaller emerging markets, smaller country, you may not have the base population. So the absolute cost of the infrastructure is way beyond means. It's just impossible. So there is this challenge. So we've got to figure out how to fund this infrastructure. And I don't think we have found a good answer to that. I can be argued, I can be called out for this. I think the kind of technology stack we are pursuing and we think we can replicate in every country is a false start. Because we got to think completely differently for many smaller country and middle-income country, what kind of tech stack they may like to have at a cheaper construct. It doesn't have to be always a centralized infrastructure. There are many fintech companies out there who can think very differently to build this infrastructure in the country. Maybe there's a policy governance construct which we can look at. And as that's your question, I think there has to be consistent policy across all market, but the outcome of that may not be the same infrastructure. What works for us in Singapore may not work for a smaller market because the costs are quite different. But the policy design which we have in terms of privacy, KYC, money laundering, all the checks, consumer protection, are replicable in other markets. So what can be exported, standardized, is the policies and regulation. What cannot be exported and standardized is the base infrastructure. And I go back to the argument that we cannot solve the inclusion problem if you don't solve for three things: social inclusion, financial inclusion, and economic inclusion. And they all need to come together. Identity is great. We have to get it consistently across all market. Financial inclusion is absolutely good. You get a bank account, money can move in and out, but we've got to create the economy. We've got to create the marketplace, and we've got to build that economic model which allows everybody to participate, whether it's a small income, low income, large income. We don't have such infrastructure. I think that's the issue. Regulation, we can figure it out. We're always good in that.
We're always good at regulation, yes. Going back, the three things that have come out again: affordability, accessibility, usability.
I just spoke about it. It's still the cost.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was going to come back to that. Affordability is key, but in order to make affordable funding happen, I think organizations like IFC also have to take a lead. Without putting you on the spot, Kim, what are you thinking of in terms of innovative financing for project funding, which is very large scale, non-recourse debt structures, first loss guarantees? What are you thinking of?
So Rama, it's all of the above. I think, as you said, there's a sense of urgency and the need to act fast, right? Because the needs are there. So we are working with our partners to raise blended financing to help de-risk projects in the higher risk markets where, on a risk-adjusted basis, the returns are not enough to attract commercial capital. We are, of course, funding and investing and advising off our own balance sheet. Just to give you a sense, over the last 10 years, we invested about $9 billion in digital infrastructure. That's a drop in the bucket. We can't do this on our own. I think the gap is more than $2 trillion just to close half of that connectivity gap by 2025. So it puts things in perspective about what the DFIs can do. And we need our partners. We need all hands on deck to work with us to catalyze the money. But when you look around the world, the capital is there. It's just not coming into the projects.
But so who are you calling out to specifically? Are you calling out to governments, impact funds? Sorry, Sopnendu, did you want to say?
I think they're doing a fabulous job. I think the issue is not funding. The issue is actually where the funding has to go. I still argue for we don't have a compatible, affordable tech stack for digital inclusion in every market. They can put billions of dollars out there, but it goes to the same bad technology. They can suck out all the capital, you still have nothing. So we got to figure out a very different architecture, a very different financial architecture for the future. I don't believe what we have today can be exported to everywhere. That's the reason why Ravi Menon made an argument for a layer 1 infrastructure. He's talking about a very different infrastructure we must think to really make it equitable.
This is true. So one of the conversations between Ravi Menon and Mr. Banga was clearly that the private sector and public sector coming together is not going to create magical outcomes in the immediate future unless the thinking headset for the private sector completely pivots around the fact that we need to make access affordable to the lowest denomination of the society, and the regulation will kick in. Is that a good summary of where you're going with
regulation will
Yeah.
be there, but I think there is no compromise on regulation. You cannot say that to make a
Yeah.
system affordable, we compromise on KYC. That's not going to happen.
Yes.
What we got to think about a new architecture. And I still go back to the argument, the elephant in the room is tech. And people keep on, oh, tech is easy, we can solve it. It's not easy.
Yes. Yes. Nick.
Let me try to give some numbers to the argument SOP is giving for it to resonate for our audience. For internet to be considered affordable, ideally it should not be more than 2% of the gross monthly income. In Africa, it's currently at 5.7. So the point SOP raises, the technology, the cost of funding is not just the solution. Rwanda, where I come from, we already have 4G internet connectivity to around 95% of our country. But what we are still seeing as a challenge is now usage. And usage is being affected by it not being affordable. So I fully concur with him that we need to rethink in terms of technology being deployed. For example, again in Rwanda, the government has a partnership with SoftBank, and they are piloting on how we can use drones to offer 5G internet. So that's the rethinking that needs to happen. It's not just about raising capital to lay broadband connectivity everywhere. That will not solve really the issue of affordability if we want to address it in the long term.
Thanks for bringing it up. This is the numbers for fact. And also, I think there's a room for better capital allocation, because you've got to also examine who is getting who is the recipient of this money. It cannot be a bunch of people thinking about technology. You should go to the actual technology.
This is true. So intermediation of financing for end purpose is a point that we all need to think about. And Nick, just to borrow your analogy, no wonder globally there is a 70% footprint coverage by a network, 50% people have access to internet, and in countries like Indonesia, only 25% actually access the internet. And we all know that if you do not get free and low-cost access to high-speed internet, what gets affected? Education, healthcare, and financial services, the three foundational pillars of digital inclusion, right? And I'm going to come back to the call to action conversation, which I think is important. This time I want to start with Nick, you. You are building a lot of what is required in participation with the government, with the public enterprises, private enterprises. Africa is doing a lot, Smart Africa, Smart Rwanda, Kigali Innovation City, 1 laptop per child. There's a ton of things that you guys are doing. What do you feel has been done, and what do you feel needs to be done? How can Asia support Africa? How can the technology partners sitting in this room support Africa?
One, this is what government needs to do more, ensuring that there is alignment, creating policy that is conducive to attract capital. There is improvement that is currently ongoing, and the pace at which it's happening needs to be more urgent, needs to be much faster. To those with capital, it's an invitation. I just mentioned if we are to close Africa's digital divide, which requires $100 billion, then we need capital. But most importantly, we also need the expertise that Asia has got. So that's my invitation to the people in the audience. Government is working on putting in place a favorable environment. It's also working to de-risk where the need has arisen. We are seeing government join into public-private partnerships, but much more needs to be done.
Thank you. Sops, I have a longish question for you. I know that you're passionate about digital infrastructure. You're passionate about technology architecture. You're passionate about pulling in investments. The question is, domestic infrastructure is one part. In an increasingly globalized world, infrastructure creation, infrastructure harmonization, and the ability to seamlessly move across this is also perhaps an emerging problem. What's your view on public versus private sector? What needs to be done?
We have taken some steps. Singapore connected payment system to UPI. We connected to prompt pay in Thailand. Today we're going to connect it to Malaysia. The governors will be here very shortly. We have proven one point. By connecting payment system, you are truly affecting everybody. Example being, I've repeated in many conferences, that after you connect it to Thailand, a domestic worker, a migrant worker in Thailand here is able to send money back home at a cost of 3%. On a public rail, through a bank account, well regulated, no issues on money laundering, which is absolutely top class, because that's what it does when you connect the network. As we build this bilateral connectivity, we soon realize it's completely expensive. It's just not sustainable. So BIS came in with a project called Nexus, and which is looking at a multilateral connectivity of payment system. But that's not enough. I think we can get there. We can have a good architecture. I think we may fall in the same trap of expensive infrastructure also there. We still got to figure out, is there alternate architecture to connect different systems? Now, when I talk of a cross-border connectivity, keep in mind, we're talking about payment connectivity, but there are other connectivity. There are connectivity between businesses, marketplace, small businesses.
Yes.
Can they trade across the different market? There are many procedures, rules, laws which prevent cross-border trade, especially small businesses. Identity, can you move identity across different market? So there are a whole set of interoperable multi-country connectivity work to be done, and which we should be more thoughtful about how to go about it. We should not repeat the mistake we did on the payment side, that we took the same standard tech stack and keep on selling to different country and nothing is happening. Cambodia being the great example of, they completely broke away from the standard tech stack of payment system. They went to a Bakong-based, DLT-based architecture. Great example. In fact, there's a little story. The Cambodian governor was going around for a vendor RFP, and then she could not afford to pay for it. And she went on her own to a different architecture by a startup out of Japan. So there are examples which can allow us to do this thing, and she was not pushing for cross-border connectivity. So we've got to look at this multiple way to get it right. A lot of work to be done.
Different horses for different courses, really.
Yes.
And there's no one size fits all. Kim, the reason I asked Nick and Sops the question first is, this is application of financing. Coming back to you, to the core of supporting infrastructure, supporting direct investments, and supporting,
Can I add a question to that? Finish your question.
Thank you. He should be the moderator. Who are you calling out to? Who do you want to work with? After this panel, who do you want reaching out to you? What's the kind of projects you're willing to fund? What is the projects that you're not willing to fund? Like, how can you get more specific about this?
So,
please add.
No. It's your question. My question to her is that, will IFC have capacity to figure out what is the right project to fund?
Yes.
Because this is very complicated. It is not a standard tech stack. Will you have the capacity and capability to understand where to put money? Sorry, to your question.
Yes, so on the first question about, who are we calling out to, partners and so on, I think we, as you said, different horses for different courses, right? So we'll be working with governments to set the right frameworks first for funding. I think you mentioned a new asset class. We signed an MOU with MAS and the World Economic Forum to think about standards for a new asset class, which is the digital inclusion financing instruments so that we understand what we're investing in, and there's definitions around what is digital inclusion, right? So we're working on that. And that involves governments to set the frameworks and to set the standards, because investors need certainty to invest for the long term, and that's what we're doing. We're of course working with other DFIs to have larger firepower at the table in terms of persuading governments, in terms of persuading regulators, and of course in terms of capital. And then it's the private sector investors, and that's PE funds, that's sovereign funds, that's insurance companies, to bring the capital to invest on a commercial basis in emerging markets. Again, it's not one size fits all. It depends on whether it's a middle income country or a low income country, depends on connectivity and so on. So it's really, it's a multi-stakeholder engagement process for digital inclusion, but more generally also for poverty alleviation. It's not just digital that we're working with. To the second question on, will we have the capacity to evaluate projects? We do evaluate projects, and we do have a very thorough due diligence process, and I think that's what we IFC are known for. And we will look at projects, again, depending on the context and where the country or the company is in terms of its development stage and what the needs are. Yeah.
The reason I asked the question because your big boss, Ajay Banga, made a statement. We're going to look at bankable project. After 6 months, I'll put the traffic light. If it looks very bad, we'll
From 27 months to 12 to 14 months is what he said.
Yeah, so that's the reason I'm just echoing his view.
No pressure, Kim. I want to take a couple of audience questions, some very interesting ones. And maybe this one I will first lob to you, Nick. In the realm of digital inclusion, is digital infrastructure or digital education more pivotal?
Both are. Both as equally as important. Let me use the case of Rwanda. We have 90% coverage. Like I mentioned, then we realized that affordability is an issue, but also aware that literacy is an issue. And the government started a program of digital ambassadors, where you have people who are training the citizen around digital skills. But then you realize that training, after a while, if they are not putting those skills to use, then you have to retrain again. So that's why I'm saying both are equally important. You can't do one and you feel you've addressed all.
So it's a circular thing.
Absolutely.
Just keep going at it until people have crossed the threshold.
Correct.
Yeah. This one is for you. You talk about social inclusion, financial inclusion, economic inclusion. In the sequence of priorities, what takes precedence is the question. And I kind of know the answer to that, but I'm still asking.
Oh, it's the social inclusion. You got to identify whom you want to help.
Yeah.
If you don't know whom you're going to help, it's a moot point.
Yeah.
Of course, then you need a bank account, and then you need to find economic activities.
And you work with many countries, right? What is the criteria that Singapore employs in selecting partner countries to engage with on this subject?
I think we have no criteria. Anybody is good, we'll partner, we'll copy sometime. And we work with Kigali, for example. If you ask the rational, there's no rational. We think there's a great partner. We think we have the same mindset. We go and work with them. We are working with Ghana and Accra. So you can't imagine the kind of countries we work with. You look at logically, it doesn't make any sense, but we work because we feel strongly that we can contribute, collaborate, and also learn from this market.
I think words of wisdom. We're in the last 30 seconds. If there are any takeaways that I want the audience to go away with, bringing price down from the private sector in order to fulfill our social obligations to ensure that that 2 billion population, which is not enjoying any part of the life that we in this room are privileged to enjoy, is just what we all need to commit ourselves to. And where it goes is building the infrastructure, deploying it at scale, and making sure that everyone participates in the digital economy.
Good summary.
Thank you. Thank you all.